The morning the trouble began was the first truly cool morning of autumn, the kind that carried a sharpness in the air reminding everyone in the neighborhood that the bright summer days were officially gone. The homeowner, a recently retired veteran still adjusting to civilian life, stepped out onto his porch to enjoy the shift in weather. The ramp he had built months earlier, a sturdy, well-crafted wooden structure stained a deep walnut, extended neatly from the porch to the driveway. It was his independence. It was his way of getting out into the world without relying on anyone else. And it was the one thing that had restored a sense of dignity after years of recovery. He noticed the envelope first. It was tucked under his welcome mat, half crushed from where the mat had been lifted and set back down. The HOA logo was printed in dark green on the front, and even before opening it, he felt the weight of an impending problem. He had heard the stories, the grumbling from neighbors about arbitrary fines, nonsensical rules, and sudden enforcement waves that swept through the community like storms. But until then, he had been left alone. Inside the envelope, folded neatly in thirds, was a notice titled Architectural Noncompliance Violation. The words were sterile, bureaucratic, and merciless. It stated that his wheelchair ramp had been installed without proper aesthetic review, and therefore violated Section 4.3 of the HOA's Exterior Modification Guidelines. The letter demanded he remove the ramp within 15 days or face a daily fine for every day it remained in place. It made no mention whatsoever of disability accommodations or legal obligations. It was simply an order. A mix of disbelief and simmering anger washed over him. He knew the Americans with Disabilities Act protected necessary accommodations, and he knew this ramp was both medically and legally justified. Yet the HOA had reduced it to an eyesore. The letter didn't even acknowledge his condition, just treated the ramp as though it were some decorative choice he had whimsically installed without permission. All day, he couldn't shake the feeling of insult. While the golden leaves blew across his driveway and the ramp creaked lightly in the afternoon breeze, he thought about the countless hours he'd spent planning it, building it, and staining it to match the home's trim. He remembered the first time he rolled down it on his own, feeling a freedom he hadn't felt since before the injury. And now a committee of strangers deemed it inconvenient to their aesthetic standards. Over the next few days, he tried to gather information, quietly at first, wanting to understand the exact nature of the supposed violation. He combed through the community handbook, flipping through its pages like a detective scanning case files. The language was vague, filled with generalities about visual harmony and preservation of neighborhood character. There was no specific clause addressing ramps or accessibility, which struck him as suspicious. He began to suspect the board simply didn't want to deal with the complexities of compliance, and instead hoped he would quietly remove the structure. The more he read, the more he noticed inconsistencies. There were rules about lawn height, restrictions on shed placement, guidelines for mailbox design. Yet several homes in the neighborhood openly violated these sections without consequence. One neighbor's mailbox leaned noticeably to the left. Another had a shed clearly visible above the fence line. Several lawns had patches of overgrown grass, especially near the outer edges of the subdivision where fewer board members lived. And yet none of them received letters. He started to see the situation differently, not as a case of simple oversight but as targeted enforcement. Something about his ramp bothered someone on the board, and they had decided to push him. Perhaps they assumed he wouldn't have the energy to fight back. Perhaps they thought a disabled veteran would simply comply, too exhausted to challenge them. Perhaps they never anticipated that he would read every word of their own rules and begin mentally cataloging every inconsistency he found. By the end of the week, he had filled an entire notebook with observations. He took photographs of violations throughout the neighborhood, not to use as ammunition, but to document the selective enforcement pattern that was emerging. The ramp was not the problem. The board's bias was. Despite this clarity, the frustration lingered. He would wheel out onto his porch each evening, watching the soft glow of porch lights flick on across the neighborhood. Everything looked peaceful on the surface, but now he knew the politics that simmered underneath. He had lived through far worse conflicts, but this one struck a different nerve, because it threatened the life he was trying to build after service, the life he had earned. When the 15-day deadline arrived, he received a second letter. This one was more aggressive. It listed the fines he would incur starting the next day and warned of potential liens if the issue was not resolved. There was no invitation for discussion, no mention of alternatives, no acknowledgement that the ramp served a medical need. It was a demand, and nothing more that he sat at his dining table, the letter laid out in front of him, the ticking of the wall clock filling the silence. The anger that had simmered for days now settled into something more focused. A plan began to form, one rooted in patience, thoroughness, and precision. He knew how to strategize. It had been his profession for years. If the HOA wanted a battle over rules, he would meet them on that battlefield. But unlike them, he would come prepared. The next morning, he visited the county office. He spoke with a representative who confirmed what he already suspected. Disability accommodations took precedence over aesthetic guidelines. He learned the process for filing a formal complaint, the legal protections in place, and the penalties for organizations that failed to comply. He left the building with a stack of pamphlets, printouts, and documents, each one a piece of armor for the fight ahead. When he returned home, he found yet another letter on his porch. This time, it was not from the HOA but from a neighbor. A single sheet of paper with a handwritten message. It expressed sympathy but urged him not to challenge the board. Most people didn't dare cross them, the note warned, because the board had a reputation for retaliation. He read the note once, folded it, and placed it in a drawer. He had faced opponents far more intimidating than a group of local volunteers with clipboards and inflated authority. If anything, the warning only strengthened his resolve. He spent the next days organizing his evidence. He sorted photographs by category, filed each violation by section number, and created a timeline of every communication he had received. The ramp, meanwhile, remained exactly where it was, solid, shining in the autumn light, a symbol of both necessity and defiance. With everything prepared, he drafted a formal response to the HOA board. It was detailed, precise, and supported by legal citation. He included photographic evidence of widespread unenforced violations and demanded an explanation for their selective targeting. He attached documentation regarding disability accommodations and notified them that he had consulted county authorities. And he offered one final line. The ramp would not be removed. He slid the letter into an envelope and placed it in the HOA's drop box just as evening fell. The air was cold, the sky dimming, and the ramp beneath his wheels felt sturdier than ever. The battle had officially begun. And as he rolled back toward his front door, he knew the board had no idea just how prepared he was, or how deeply he had already begun uncovering their own buried mistakes. The HOA board wasted no time responding to the homeowner's meticulously prepared letter. Within 48 hours, a formal notice appeared in his mailbox, this one written in a strikingly defensive tone. It dismissed his claims, reiterated their demand for the ramp's removal, and insisted that the HOA was fully within its rights to enforce community standards. Yet the tone had changed. Gone was the dismissive confidence of their earlier notices. Their words felt reactive, almost jittery, as if they sensed they had provoked someone who would not back down easily. The homeowner read the letter slowly, noting the lack of citations. The board had offered no direct reference to the legal statutes he had provided, nor any explanation for the clear discrepancies in enforcement he had documented. Instead, they had doubled down on vague phrasing. It was as though they hoped sheer insistence would overshadow logic. But the most telling detail wasn't in the letter itself. It was in what happened that evening. From his living room window, he noticed two members of the board walking down the street, clipboards in hand. They stopped in front of his house briefly, their eyes fixed on the ramp, their expressions a blend of irritation and uncertainty. They scribbled notes, exchanged hushed remarks, and continued down the block. They were nervous. He recognized the signs. They hadn't expected him to push back with such precision, and now they were scrambling. The next few days brought signs of internal upheaval within the HOA. Neighbors began whispering. A few approached him discreetly as he moved about the yard, offering updates. One confided that an emergency board meeting had been called. Another mentioned that the board president had been overheard ranting about entitled homeowners who think they know the law. Yet another mentioned that one of the board members had privately admitted the ramp issue had been handled poorly from the start. For years, the board had operated unchecked, relying on residents' reluctance to challenge them. They weren't used to someone demanding transparency. They weren't used to someone documenting their inconsistencies. And they certainly weren't used to someone who understood jurisdiction, state codes, and regulatory procedures better than they did. Word spread that the homeowner had gone to the county office. Rumors circulated that he was preparing to file a formal complaint. Some neighbors, emboldened by the situation, started examining their own grievances with the board. There was talk of forming a petition to review the HOA's enforcement practices. Tension rippled quietly through the community. Meanwhile, the homeowner continued building his case. He made a spreadsheet documenting every neighbor's property feature that conflicted with the HOA handbook. Mailboxes askew, sheds in restricted zones, mismatched fencing, holiday lights left up beyond the allowed dates. He wasn't doing it out of spite. He was doing it to demonstrate unmistakably that the HOA had ignored dozens of violations while focusing solely on him. He attended county workshops on disability rights and local housing law, gathering more material. He reached out to an advocacy group specializing in homeowner disputes. They offered guidance and confirmed that the HOA was on precarious legal ground. His ramp, they explained, wasn't merely justified, it was protected. Denying his accommodation could expose the HOA to fines, sanctions, and mandated policy revisions. The homeowner felt a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time since retiring, he felt the clarity of mission that had once guided him through far more dangerous situations. This time, the battlefield was paperwork, precedent, and patience, and he was winning ground. A week later, the board escalated matters. They sent him a document-stamped final warning, claiming they would begin issuing daily fines the following morning. The notice was curt, devoid of the strained professionalism they had previously attempted. It read like a last-ditch effort to intimidate him into compliance. He didn't flinch. Instead, he added the new letter to his growing file and drafted an updated report for the county's compliance office. The moment the fines began, he would submit the complaint. That evening, the atmosphere in the neighborhood felt tense. An SUV pulled into the driveway across the street, a board member's home. From his porch, he observed the driver step out and talk anxiously on the phone. Later, lights flicked on in various houses where board members lived, illuminating silhouettes pacing behind curtains. It was as if the entire leadership of the HOA could feel something closing in around them. And they were right. At dawn the next day, the first fine notice arrived, $150, marked in bold. The letter stated the amount would increase daily until the ramp was removed. But what the HOA didn't know was that, just an hour earlier, the homeowner had submitted his entire case file to the county. He had included photos, letters, timestamps, and a detailed narrative. He had even attached copies of the HOA's own handbook, annotated to highlight contradictions. Submitting the complaint felt like the final step in a long march. Now, the process was in motion. 2 days later, signs of the county's involvement became impossible for the neighborhood to ignore. A pair of vehicles, plain white sedans with county department decals, entered the subdivision. They moved slowly, deliberately, stopping at various houses. Officials stepped out with clipboards and tablets, knocking on doors, taking notes, photographing common areas. At one point, the officials stood in front of the ramp for nearly 10 minutes, reviewing documents and comparing them with the physical structure. Their demeanor was calm, assured, and entirely unbothered by anyone watching. News spread like wildfire. Neighbors whispered over fences. A few approached the homeowner with curious or encouraging words. The HOA board members, meanwhile, seemed to retreat. They drove past the ramp with quick glances, but none stopped to confront him. None delivered new notices. None issued the next fine. In fact, the fines abruptly ceased the day the county vehicles arrived. Something had broken inside the board's structure, a crack spreading silently through the foundation of their authority. Yet the homeowner knew the real confrontation still lay ahead. The county would conduct its investigation, compare policies, review complaints, and determine whether the HOA had violated housing laws. Rumors circulated that a mandatory meeting with the HOA and county officials was being scheduled. Some residents speculated that the board might face penalties. Others wondered if resignations were imminent. But the homeowner didn't speculate. He prepared. He organized his documents again, refining them, adding notes, clarifying dates. He rehearsed the sequence of events in his mind. He wasn't seeking victory for the sake of pride, only fairness, clarity, and the right to keep the ramp that allowed him to live independently. The ramp, steady and resilient, remained in place as leaves continued to fall around it. By the end of the week, the HOA delivered one more notice. This one marked not as a warning, but as an invitation. It requested his presence at a special hearing to discuss the ramp issue in light of new information. The phrasing was noticeably softer, the tone suddenly diplomatic. It was clear they were under pressure. The homeowner set the letter aside, understanding what it signaled. The board was beginning to fear the consequences of their actions. But the process wasn't finished. Not yet. And the next chapter of the conflict would expose even more than they expected. He closed the blinds as evening settled, the ramp visible only as a silhouette beneath the porch light. The board had launched the fight, but now the momentum was shifting, and the truth was about to surface. The night before the scheduled special hearing, the homeowner sat at his dining table reviewing his files one last time. The ramp outside was quiet, washed in a pool of soft yellow light from the porch lamp. Its sturdy planks cast long, unwavering shadows against the driveway. It had become more than a functional structure. It had become a symbol of everything he had fought to reclaim: independence, dignity, and the right to live without obstruction. He felt a calm, steady focus. The board had demanded compliance, but the moment they involved legal processes they didn't understand, the conflict had ceased to be one-sided. Now, with the county investigating and neighbors quietly questioning the board's conduct, the balance had shifted. He sensed something pivotal was about to occur. The morning of the hearing arrived crisp and bright. Leaves rustled across the pavement, and a faint chill lingered in the air as he rolled down the ramp toward the community center, the temporary meeting place chosen by the HOA. Several neighbors watched from their porches. Some nodded quietly. Others simply observed, sensing the tension unfolding. The board had gone too far, and the community knew it. Inside the community center, the board members sat at a long folding table, their expressions carefully composed but tight with unease. A few stacks of papers cluttered the table, likely attempts at documentation hastily assembled in response to the county's inquiry. A single empty chair sat at the opposite side of the room, positioned for the homeowner, as though the setting had been arranged like a scene in a procedural drama. County officials arrived shortly afterward. Two representatives, calm and professional, greeted the board with polite neutrality, but their presence alone exerted pressure. They laid out folders, tablets, and printed statutes relating to housing law, disability protections, and homeowners' rights. Everything about their demeanor signaled authority, real authority, not the self-appointed variety the board had long relied upon. The homeowner took his place, and as the meeting commenced, the true unraveling began. The board opened with an attempt to justify their initial violation notice. They spoke of neighborhood standards, visual cohesion, and proper procedures for exterior modifications. But their voices lacked conviction. Their words looped vaguely, circling general principles without addressing specific laws. It was as though they hoped repetition would create legitimacy. The county officials listened without interruption. When the board finished, the officials began their own review, methodically pulling up state and federal guidelines. They reiterated the foundational requirement: disability accommodations supersede HOA aesthetic preferences. They cited cases, precedents, and exact statutory language, dismantling the board's claims point by point. The board members shifted uneasily. Their carefully maintained expressions began to crack. Then came the moment that changed everything. The officials produced a printed copy of the homeowner's formal complaint. They acknowledged the clarity and thoroughness of the evidence submitted. They confirmed they had examined the photographs of neighborhood violations and noted the pattern of selective enforcement. They explained how disproportionate targeting of a single resident, especially one with a documented medical need, could qualify as discriminatory behavior. A murmur rippled through the small audience of neighbors who had gathered along the back wall of the room. The board members' stiff postures faltered. It wasn't just a dispute anymore. It was a potential legal infraction. The homeowner knew this was the fulcrum, the point at which the entire weight of the board's decisions would tip. And tip it did. One county official asked to see all correspondence the board had sent him. The board's president reluctantly produced printed copies. As the officials reviewed them, the absence of any citation to legal accommodations became glaring. The language was cold, punitive, and dismissive, exactly as the homeowner had received it. The officials then asked whether the board had consulted state accessibility laws before issuing the violation. Silence filled the room. A few glances were exchanged. A few heads lowered. The truth was clear even without an answer. When the officials finished, they delivered their findings. The board had failed to comply with housing regulations. They had not only issued improper notices, but they had also neglected to provide avenues for reasonable accommodation. Their actions constituted procedural violations and, potentially, discriminatory enforcement. The officials announced that the ramp was legally protected and would remain, not temporarily, not conditionally, permanently. But the consequences did not end there. The board was instructed to suspend all enforcement actions related to the ramp. They were warned that continued pressure could result in formal penalties. They were directed to revise their handbook to include explicit language regarding accessibility accommodations. And they were informed that the county would be reviewing the HOA's enforcement patterns in the coming weeks. A review that could lead to mandated oversight or the replacement of certain board members. The homeowner listened with a quiet, steady satisfaction. He hadn't wanted to humiliate anyone, but he had wanted accountability. And now accountability was unfolding in real time. When the meeting adjourned, the silence from the board was heavy. A few neighbors approached him privately, expressing gratitude for challenging the system. Some admitted they had long felt powerless against the board's overreach. Others simply nodded with quiet respect, aware that he had fought a battle on behalf of more people than himself. As he rolled back outside into the crisp daylight, he noticed something unexpected. Several neighbors had gathered along the sidewalk near his ramp. They weren't there to protest or gawk. They were there to support. A few offered friendly waves, others shared brief words, but the atmosphere was clear. The narrative of the neighborhood had changed. The ramp, once labeled an eyesore, now stood as a testament to resilience and rightful defiance. Over the following days, the HOA's behavior shifted dramatically. Notices became polite. Meetings were suddenly open to more residents. The board's president stepped down quietly, leaving a vacancy that would later be filled by someone far more reasonable. Rumors circulated of internal disagreements, resignations, and heated debates behind closed doors. The board had been shaken to its core. The homeowner, however, simply lived his life. He enjoyed the ease with which he could move from porch to driveway. He tended the small garden bed beside the ramp. He greeted neighbors with a relaxed smile. The battle had been fought, and it had been won not through anger or chaos, but through patience, knowledge, and unshakable resolve. Weeks later, as winter's chill crept into the neighborhood, he stepped onto the ramp one morning and looked over the quiet street. Frost glistened on rooftops. The air was crisp and hushed. The ramp beneath him, strong as ever, seemed to gleam with quiet victory. What had started as an attempt to strip him of independence had instead exposed an entire system of negligence. And in the process, it had empowered not only him but many of his neighbors. The HOA had tried to fine him for his wheelchair ramp. They had underestimated him. They had underestimated the law. And they had underestimated the quiet strength of someone who had already fought far harder battles than they could ever comprehend. In the end, the ramp stayed. Legally, permanently, triumphantly, and the board? They were the ones who found themselves scrambling, correcting, and answering for actions they once believed no one would dare question. The neighborhood changed that winter, and it all began with a single letter on a doorstep and the resolve of a man who refused to be pushed aside.